So today we have a bit of a news roundup with director of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Naoki Hamaguchi, where he sat down with a number of different outlets to discuss Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but also Remake Part 3 and what they want to do with the Final Fantasy VII universe moving forward once this trilogy has wrapped up. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe to help out the channel, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So Hamaguchi is a very busy man leading up to the Golden Joystick 2024 awards, where Rebirth walked away with 4 wins, including Best Storytelling, Best Soundtrack, and Best Performances for Cody Christian and Brianna White. He's been a very busy man, and he got the opportunity to sit down with a number of different outlets to discuss the franchise, some of the valid criticisms, and where they want to go with Part 3. And Hamaguchi is very much an open book. This is a guy who, you give him an inch, he's going to take a mile, especially when it comes to Remake Part 3. And it's kind of funny to see, him talk about Part 3 and just kind of see how much can he get away with before Square Enix kind of steps in and tells him, look man, you're going too far, you got to reel it back in, you're revealing too much information. And I think a lot of that just comes from the fact he's so passionate about FF7 and what they're doing with Remake Part 3 that he just wants to share that info with people, but it's kind of funny how much he actually kind of gets away with. But to start off first, we talk about probably the most controversial, the most discussed part of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It's not the storytelling, it's not the ending, it's not the combat, it's not Chadley, it is the minigames. There's been so much criticism about these minigames, good and bad. What does Hamaguchi think about the entire thing, including exploring regions and having different monster fights, and in general, world building? To get the answers to those, we start off with VG247, where Hamaguchi goes on to say, obviously, there's a great battle system in Rebirth, and there's a lot of fun to be had in fighting the various different monsters in each region. But I wanted it to feel like a breath of fresh air when you entered each different region, that you feel like there's something new and exciting to do when you enter a new area, that you can experience something different with the mechanics. That's why we wanted to put so many different mini-games in, and I feel we really managed to achieve our goal with that. It's simply a breath of fresh air in an open world, or open field as we call it for Rebirth. And I really like that term, open field. I don't think I've ever heard anyone really use that before. We've used terms like biomes and large areas, but open field just kind of perfectly describes what Rebirth is, because it's not quite open world. I think Remake Part 3 is going to be that open world game, because we're going to get access to the other part of the planet and fully explore on Chocobo, on foot, or via the High Wind. But in terms of the overall structure of what they did with Rebirth and the world building, I think they did a good job. You get to each region and it is so different from the region you were just in, or the region that you're about to go to, in terms of how you talk to people, how people traverse the lands, what type of mini games they're playing, as well as what kind of monsters are in each area. And that was one of my favorite things, was completing different tasks in the area to unlock a big monster fight, and learning more about the land along the way, and also the lore behind the monster that you were going to fight. I thought that was really well done. And for a lot of people, there's a valid criticism of it feeling a little too hand-holdy. They want more exploration, which the devs have already confirmed will be in Part 3, so no worries there. But when you're dealing with these open world games or open field games, one of the most important aspects is that world building, making those regions feel fresh and different from what came before it, but also making the world feel lived in. Like, these are NPCs that you come to really care about, and how their way of life is different from other areas of the world. For example, how characters pass the time. You get to Under Junon, and the kids there, their idea of having fun is entering this noxious pink cloud that turns them into frogs. And then they go play as frogs. That's their idea of passing time, or having fun with Mr. Dolphin. Or you get to Cosmo Canyon and the people there are really serious about chocobos and training their chocobos and learning to do these obstacle courses to train said chocobos so they can then go compete in a race. So I think they really did a fantastic job with that aspect of the world building. Every area feels so different and unique to the people that live there. But one of the most common criticisms of Rebirth was those mini games. There was maybe just too many of them. Some were really great, some were kind of bad, some were right in the middle. So what does Hamaguchi think of the criticisms of the mini games in Rebirth, and how are they going to handle that for Remake Part 3? To answer that, we have to move over to dailystar.co.uk, which I have to say is one frickin' hellscape of a website to navigate. Oh my god. The amount of ads, video ads, pop-up ads, gossip columns. I'm pretty sure my phone has about 25 different viruses right now because I went to this website. It's a nightmare to navigate. But on the plus side, they are offering me a pretty big discount on Ozempic, so I guess I'll consider that one a win. But let's get to what Hamaguchi says in regards to part 3. He would say, I think what we did with Rebirth, the structure of the game, the balance of everything in it was very good, and it was received very well by the fans. So I don't think there's any need for major changes there really. One thing perhaps that maybe needs looking at is that there was a certain number of people who said there were too many minigames in Rebirth, and ultimately I can see their point of view, but I do think we made the right decision in terms of the breadth and the volume of content for the minigames in Rebirth. Obviously, the more different types of content, the more minigames you put into a title, the more likely it is that people will like some and not others. Obviously, it comes down to personal taste in a lot of ways. Everyone's going to have some of the minigames that we really liked and really enjoyed, and maybe some they didn't get on with so much. And that will depend on the player, and it'll be different for different players. Which, he hits the nail on the head. And the one thing I really appreciate about Hamaguchi and the team is that they are willing to listen to fan criticisms. And when I say fan criticisms, I'm talking legitimate concerns and critiques about the mechanics themselves. And the fact that they're so willing to listen to people and make adjustments for the next game, I think is super reassuring and leaves me not only more confident in part 3, but more excited for it. And the way he describes the minigame thing is totally true. And I get why there's so many minigames, because again, this is like Square Enix's first big open field kind of game. And there's probably that fear of, okay, we need to make sure we have enough things for people to do. Otherwise, you end up in a Final Fantasy XV situation where you have this really big world, but there's not really much to do other than go to dungeons and hunt monsters and maybe go to a diner or a gas station. There's not a lot populating that world. So it could have been a situation where maybe they just kind of over-prepared when it came to the amount of minigames that they wanted in each region. And the way he describes them is perfect. Like for me, I love the piano minigame. I was so excited to get to a new region, try and figure out what song belonged to that region, and then getting to play it was just so satisfying for my brain. Hitting those notes with the analog sticks was just so much fun. On the flip side of that, there were people that hated the piano minigame. They just couldn't get the rhythm down and didn't enjoy it. And then you've got something like Queen's Blood, which was almost universally praised by fans. And a lot of people are saying like, okay, if you do one thing for Remake Part 3, you gotta bring back Queen's Blood. We need more Queen's Blood. It is fantastic. So when it comes to minigames for Part 3, will Part 3 have the same amount? Hamaguchi would say, so I don't think we failed at all in the decision of having such a broad amount of content there. It was what was needed for the game, but certainly looking forward to the third game and to other games, if you asked me, would I do the same number of minigames? I don't think I would. We'll work out how maybe we can cut it down to maybe a bit more manageable size for the group of players who quite rightly said that maybe there was too much there for them, which is the right approach. Again, the fact that they listen to people and are going to alter that for Part 3 is great, and it really does make sense. When you look at, the story of where Remake Part 3 is heading, it's going to be one of those games where the characters hit the ground running and they don't really have time to stop and do all these different mini games. There's so much that's going to happen in that last section of the story. It's going to be this big blockbuster globe-trotting adventure. There's resolving the issues with Cloud. There's tracking down and fighting all of the weapons. There's, this potentially big war that's going to happen between Shinra and Wutai. There's just the overall change to exploration in particular and making it so much more spontaneous. So you're not going to really have time to do a ton of mini games. So I think pulling back on the amount in Part 3 makes all of the sense in the world. I think they're probably going to strike the right balance for Part 3 when it comes to that stuff. And we might even have a situation where they take what would have been a mini game and maybe implement it into the actual mechanics of the game in a way that works. For example, snowboarding. Now, I do think snowboarding is going to be in the gold saucer in Part 3. They teased it in Rebirth, but it would be cool to take the snowboarding aspect of that minigame and give it to the characters as they traverse that icicle in snowy environment. So you're not just running everywhere. Maybe there are certain areas where you need a snowboard to go down a big massive hill or mountain, or you have to jump off of something to reach a new area that maybe a chocobo can't get you to. So that would be kind of cool. But I think their frame of mind here is the right mindset. Now, is there one regret Hamaguchi actually does have when it comes to the minigames and the Platinum Trophy? Yeah, and he actually offers an apology for the people that were trying to platinum Rebirth. He would go on to say, I think there is one other thing actually, which I can say was a mistake on my part, something that I've already apologized for, and I definitely will not do again, which is how difficult I made it to get the platinum trophy. So rest assured, I have learned from that, and in future, I will not be making platinum trophies that difficult. So for all of the platinum trophy hunters out there, you can rest easy. Part 3 probably won't be as insane to achieve that platinum trophy. So moving forward on this hellscape of a website, what about turn-based combat for Final Fantasy? Does Hamaguchi see that making a return for the franchise? Hamaguchi goes on to say, first of all, I'm not going to say that turn-based is better than action-based or the other way around. They've both got their places and they can both be really great gaming experiences. I think certainly we've seen that with Metaphor. He would then go on to call the game really great. I will say that in terms of the advantages and disadvantages between them, having a more action-based style, it's all down to the input really. The idea that if you push the button, your actions are immediately reflected on screen, which generally leads to a higher level of immersion. Which I agree with. I love turn-based, I love action stuff. It's really all kind of like the mindset you walk into for a video game. And I have seen a lot of critiques on my channel in particular. People hate the combat. They wish it was turn-based. They want Final Fantasy in general to just go back to turn-based because if they do that, it will fix every issue that Final Fantasy has and it's going to start selling 10 to 12 million units a game because turn-based will save it. I don't think it's as simple as that. That's not how it works. But I do love what they did with this game's combat in particular because I really feel like the spirit of that original FF7, the turn-based stuff, is still alive and well in the Remake trilogy. But instead of picking, a command and then waiting for your other character to get their command and then having everyone take their turn, you're doing all of that now, but in real time on the fly. So I'm still doing the strategery in my head of planning out a fight, what I need to do, what character needs to do this, action next. It's just all in real time. So for me, that really I don't know what the word would be, lubricates maybe the section of my brain that is super ADD and just gives me that, tactile response right out the gate. So I really feel like it's the best blend of turn-based with action, and I really hope that they consider using this combat system moving forward in some capacity for future Final Fantasy games. Now, speaking of future Final Fantasy games, what plans do they have moving forward for the Final Fantasy VII franchise? Hamaguchi says, I want it, Remake Chapter 3, to come out as quickly as possible, and then move on maybe to look at some other stories, dig a bit deeper. There's definitely a call out there to see other spotlights on other parts of the world and the universe, different characters, so I'd like to maybe switch to looking at them in a different way after we've got the third game out. Which to me is super interesting because, one of the issues you run into with after you complete the 7 Remake trilogy is how do you continue in this world of FF7? It kind of creates, a challenge that Advent Children had of creating this brand new story with newer characters that has to either stand side by side with the OG story or surpass it, which creates a massive hurdle for these developers. And I feel like that's what they're going to face after they finish the Remake trilogy. Do they go in a direction where Cloud and company come back and have a new threat to face? Because then it's like, is it going to be as good? People are going to compare it to the OG FF7 and even the Remake trilogy. Or do you do a complete 180 like Hamaguchi almost kind of hints at, and you focus on different characters? And if you do that, you might create backlash from people who want Cloud in the party to come back and they don't want to focus on these other characters. And even then, do you do them as brand new video games or do you make them DLC? Because that's a really cool aspect of Remake Part 3 is that it's the end of the story, but if you want to, you can expand now. You don't have to worry about going from Rebirth to Remake Part 3 and wasting time in between those games for DLC. You've already moved on to 3, you've completed it, now what do? Do you want to expand it with DLC or make something completely new that is a AAA full price title? It creates a very interesting problem, but if the same people who are in charge of the Remake trilogy continue to move forward to expand this universe and they end up doing the next FF7 game, whether it's an Advent Children style story or they bring Cloud and the party back for a new threat or they introduce new characters, I feel like I would personally be pretty comfortable with that idea because I know who's making the game. And I think they've done an incredible job with Remake and Rebirth and are probably going to, top themselves with Remake Part 3, that whatever they want to do in the future, as long as that core people are involved, I don't really have any worries. And the thing we will end on is the fact that this is a trilogy, that they split up the story into 3 parts, and there's been a lot of backlash over that, which we will address, but Hamaguchi wants to kind of address that and hopefully let people know that, yeah, after the response to Rebirth, maybe people can now see why it was a good idea to split up these games into a trilogy. And to answer that question, we move over to Games Radar, which is a much better website, nowhere near the level of Daily Star. I can actually look at this one. Hamaguchi goes on to say, I think when we first announced that we were going to do the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, not just as one game, but as a series of games, which ultimately became a trilogy, there were a number of different reactions to that. Mixed reactions, I think. Obviously, since then, we've released the first game in the series, FF7 Remake, in this game, Rebirth, and I think this has proven our concept now. With us being the most nominated game at Golden Joysticks, also the most nominated game at the Game Awards later this year, I think people have finally come around to understand the reasons, the advantages, and why it's a good thing to have it as a trilogy. So hopefully people are a bit more convinced now, which I am in full favor of. We've done videos on my channel looking back at, the announcement that FF7 was going to be a episodic event. It wasn't just going to be one game. And from the beginning of that announcement all the way to current day, you still have people shouting into the sky on Twitter saying that, oh, Square Enix doesn't care about FF7. This is clearly a cash grab. This should have been one game. They're just trying to milk the story and their consumers by having 3 games. It's trash. And I feel like a lot of those people who say that stuff, even to this day, probably didn't even play Remake and probably didn't play Rebirth. So it kind of feels disingenuous to a degree. But even back then, I was saying like, yeah, if you're going to do this game on modern hardware, you're going to have to split up that story or make some pretty severe sacrifices to the game's story, to the areas that you visit, to even things like combat, because there's different scenarios that would have happened. You've got the current scenario that we're in, which I think is great because the devs can make one game, take feedback from fans from that specific game, and apply it moving forward to the next iteration. That is a really big advantage, and the devs took advantage of that from Remake to Intermission to Rebirth, refining things like combat, adding in the ability to now explore a region instead of being stuck to Midgar. And obviously you still have fans that don't like it. They will complain. But the flip side of that is, if Square Enix did decide to make this one whole game instead of 3 different parts, I think that kind of splinters off into 2 other scenarios. One, the game wouldn't even be out yet, because if they wanted to stay true to the original vision, they would still be developing it because they would have to worry about the entire story, building an entire world in one go instead of, game by game. So people would have been complaining about that. Where's my FF7 Remake, Square? You announced it 50 years ago and I still can't play it. You guys are trash. The other aspect is that if they did make it in one go, again, it would have severe cuts to the story, to the locations you visit, to the overall vibe of the game, which would have upset that same crowd of people. Oh, you released a game and it's not the full game like I remember. You cut this area, you cut this boss battle, you cut this character, you cut this storyline. It would have been a mess. And the thing is, when it comes to FF7 Remake's trilogy, you're never going to please everyone. And on the flip side of that, you're gonna have people that won't touch this trilogy until part 3 comes out because they want to experience everything in one go from part 1 to 2 to 3. You're also gonna have people that play Remake and decide that, this isn't really for me. So they end up dipping out and not playing Rebirth, and consequently probably won't play part 3 either. So it's a process. You can just put the best product you can together, put it out there, and just see how people respond to it. And I do feel like that section of fans that complain about a lot of this stuff are probably a vocal minority. And because there's social media, it can really amplify those specific voices and kind of paint the picture that it's all one big negative thing. But I'm with Hamaguchi, man. I fully love that this is a trilogy because, again, they can expand and improve in so many different ways that they couldn't if they just released one product. And if you just released that one game, you gotta live with it, the positive and the negative. So I like what they've been doing. And again, when it comes to the story, you know, the Remake trilogy is a bit of a quasi-sequel. It is still staying faithful to certain aspects of the OG story, but they are taking some new turns, some new twists with how they're telling the story. Bringing back characters like Zack, introducing the idea of all of these worlds within the life stream. What is Sephiroth's goal this time around? It's different. So that has to be so exciting and refreshing for the devs, not just doing the same thing over again and retelling the same story, but doing something that's got a new flourish on it. Whatever they decide to do with this franchise after part 3, personally, as cool as it would be to see them bring in new characters, I really just love Cloud and the party so much that I want to see them go on a new adventure. Again, you just have that issue of, does that new adventure stand side by side with OG FF7 and the Remake trilogy, or does it fall short of that, or does it somehow surpass what they did before? With that being said, I'm losing my voice. I'm running out of breath, and I need to check on my phone because I think it has, again, about 80 viruses since I started recording this audio to when I'm finishing because of that website. But leave your thoughts in the comments down below on any of the things we discussed in today's video. Specifically, where do you guys want to see the Final Fantasy VII universe go after Remake Part 3? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.